MSP Murdo Fraser joins us now from Dundee. Murdo Fraser, the SNP put into their manifesto, on which they won to form a government, that if there was a material change, there should be a second referendum. There has clearly been a material change, so they're entirely within their rights to call a second referendum.
Well, of course, the SNP don't have a majority in the Scottish Parliament. They went into the Scottish Parliament election with a majority, and they lost their majority on that very manifesto that you mentioned about. And of course, we had a vote in 2014. It's not even 3 years since we had a referendum.
But there's been a material change.
We had a very high turnout. Well, let's remember in 2014 we knew that there was an EU referendum in prospect. We knew that was happening. It was mentioned in the SNP's white paper. But even if we accept the material change argument, the SNP do not have a majority in the Scottish Parliament. They lost their majority based upon their manifesto.
So there is a majority in the Scottish Parliament for a second referendum. You have a, I mean, well, you say they don't have a majority. The whole system was designed not to give anybody a majority, but for a period the SNP did. And with the Green Party, there is a majority in the Parliament. The Greens are a pro-independence party too. They also talked about a change with Brexit. They're a pro-Europe party too. The Scottish Parliament is entirely within its rights to call for another referendum, is it not?
Well, two things. First of all, the 6 Green members were not elected on that basis. They were elected on the manifesto that said they would have to get 1 million signatures on a petition before they would support another referendum. Now, that has not been met. But there's another point here about the Scottish Parliament, and I couldn't but smile listening to your interview with Angus Robertson, who, of course, doesn't sit in the Scottish Parliament, but you think might pay attention as Deputy Leader of the SNP as to what's going on. Because the SNP government in Edinburgh routinely ignore and dismiss votes in the Scottish Parliament when they lose them. Just last week, they lost a vote on education. 2 weeks ago, they lost 2 votes. They lost a vote a few weeks ago on the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act. What happens to the Scottish government when they lose votes in the Scottish Parliament? They ignore them. And now they've got the arrogance and temerity to say that the UK government has to listen to votes in the Scottish Parliament when the SNP Scottish government ignore votes in the Scottish Parliament. You couldn't make it up. And Angus Robertson seemed to be completely ignorant.
Well, what bit of the 2016 SNP manifesto don't you understand? It said clearly, we believe that the Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. And that's exactly what has happened. So why are you complaining that, I mean, I know that your party's had a bit of problems delivering its manifesto recently, but they're delivering what they promised in their manifesto.
And of course, that is the manifesto on which they fought an election, which they went into with a parliamentary majority and came out having lost their majority. And let's be absolutely clear.
They got 46.5% of the vote, Mr. Fraser.
But they didn't get a majority.
You got half that.
People in Scotland, and our votes more than doubled. As you know, our seats more than doubled in the Scottish Parliament. People in Scotland do not want another referendum. It is a distraction from the important business that the SNP need to be getting on with, sorting out the mess they made of the Scottish economy, of education, of the health service and of the justice system. That's what they need to be doing. And people do not take kindly to this distraction.
Well, we will see.
We will
see how opinion goes with this standoff on that, and it certainly will be interesting to see whether the Scottish people balk at the idea of Westminster stopping it, or whether they don't care as much as Mr. Robertson would have us believe. But what is your position? What is the Tory position? Is it the timing of a second referendum that you object to, or the very principle of a second referendum?
Well, what Theresa May made clear yesterday is that we are not saying no, not ever. What we're saying is not now. The time is not right. The case has not been made for another referendum.
But if not now and not ever, then when? Between now and never, when?
Well, what we have to do is have an informed decision. The people of Scotland must be able to make an informed choice about their future. Now, that means 2 things.
That's not a referendum.
Understanding what Brexit means and understanding what the consequences of Brexit are for the UK and for Scotland, and also understanding what the alternative would be, because the SNP are claiming they want a referendum because we're supposedly being taken out of the EU against our will.
Well,
And yet, in the last few days, in the last few days, it has become entirely unclear what the SNP position on EU membership is. They're suggesting that an independent Scotland would not automatically go back into the EU
I understand
as a full
all that,
member.
Mr. Fraser,
so
but you
their
see,
entire basis for another referendum goes out the water.
I ask you about Tory policy, and you tell me about SNP policy. I know what SNP policy is, and where it isn't, I know where it isn't. I'm asking you what your policy is. If not before Brexit, would you agree to a referendum once the Brexit deal is done and dusted?
Well, what the Prime Minister said yesterday was the tests would be that we would see the consequences of Brexit and the impact of that. We would see what the SNP alternative would be. And if there was a demonstrable demand from the Scottish people for another referendum, then at that time we would consider it. But we're not going to do it before those tests are made.
All right. Okay, Mr. Fraser, thank you very much for joining us.